very, very cold night. Halloween, what could you expect? This is the first of our series of winter talks. We have a special one tonight. We will also have a special one circa Fair Boris time and one before Christmas. So now, just to move on with tonight, as you know, the proceeds of tonight are going to the cause of a very loyal and good friend, Ronan O'Connell, and we wish him, he's been here before, we hope he'll be here again. To get us going tonight on Then and Now, we have none other than our own beloved son, famous son of Varsity, Professor Gerry Boyle, renowned and respected economist in this country and indeed overseas. Why so? He has been an economic advisor to none other than the late Teagasc, John Bruton. He's been head of the economics department in Maynooth. He has been a director of Teagasc, where he led a mighty organisation with distinction at home in Ireland and overseas for none other than 14 years. He is currently an independent director of Arabon and Tipperary Co-op. Now, he's a consultant to the World Bank. He's also a director of 3 charities, including one foreign NGO. He was awarded an honorary doctorate in science by UCC. He was awarded an academic PAM from the French government. That is just a synopsis of his CV. We're delighted and we're honoured to have our own native son back in Varsity. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Gerry Boyle.
Thanks. Thanks very much, and good evening everyone. And as Michael said, it's a bad night out there, so I'm delighted to see so many people here. Given the night that's in it, I'm not sure whether my presentation is going to be a trick or a treat, but I'll leave you decide that, okay? I want to thank, of course, Michael, the Borsley Historical Society, and especially yourself, for the invitation to speak this evening. I also want to thank Seamus Tynan, I think you're there somewhere, I saw you come in, Seamus, who provided much needed information for me on the origins and development of milk processing in this parish over the years. And I'm proud to say that is the second opportunity I've had to speak to this society. And of course I've attended a number of excellent sessions over the last number of years. So for my talk this evening, I'm going to focus on some key milestones in the evolution of modern Irish agriculture. And as you can see, I've entitled my talk Then and Now. And I'm taking the late 1950s and the early 1960s as the benchmark for assessing the major changes in Irish agriculture in modern times. But I'm going to look back a little bit first, before that. In my view, there are 2 central themes in the history of Irish independence. One concerns the emergence of a physical force movement, and the other emphasises the parallel emergence of a strong national identity centred around all aspects of our culture and sporting life. The focus on wresting control of the land from the landlords was, of course, also a potent political movement that often had a violent past. I think it's sobering to remember, by the time that the Irish Free State was established, about 30% of the land of Ireland was still owned by landlords. But I don't think what's as well appreciated is the importance of economic emancipation in embedding the desire for independence in our national psyche. In my view, the drive for economic emancipation was almost exclusively associated with the emergence of the cooperative movement at the turn of the 19th century. The birth of modern Irish agriculture can indeed be traced back to the 1890s. This period coincided with the establishment initially of privately owned creameries, but these private creameries were soon joined by the newly minted cooperatives, are known colloquially, of course, and still known as the co-ops, or if you're from the northern part of the country, the co-ops. In time, the private processors fell away and the co-ops emerged as the dominant players. The emergence of the cooperative movement had a profound impact on the development of the Irish dairy processing sector. It's probably not well known that the cooperative model was invented in Ireland by none other than Horace Plunkett. Plunkett had the vision to see that cooperation was an essential organisational innovation that was critical to unlocking the potential of a small and severely capital constrained farm production sector. Prior to creameries, milk was crudely processed on farm, mainly through the production of butter. Ireland had an export outlet in the UK, but its foothold in that market was obliterated over time by the higher quality of product that was being produced by Denmark. Indeed, it took several years to regain a footprint in that and other international markets. The invention of the centrifugal separator, this is on your right hand side here, essentially drove milk processing off farm. In the absence of the co-ops, the capital needed to exploit this new technology was provided by private finance. And this, of course, is rarely a satisfactory situation, as it places farmers at a severe disadvantage when it comes to getting a satisfactory price for a perishable commodity like milk. It's difficult to imagine the leap of faith that was required by farmers in the Ireland of the 1890s and early 1900s to provide hard-earned cash to invest in a venture that was relatively unknown to many people at the time. Indeed, it would take several years before the state supplied capital to the co-ops. Some of you may be familiar with what's now called Mary Cochrana's Millions or Mary's Millions. Up until relatively recently, I think it is the case that farm families throughout the length and breadth of Ireland could recall the sacrifices that had to be made for farm families to invest in their co-op. The provision of capital via cooperatives was a reflection of the social capital nature of the entire process. No individual farmer who possessed at the time only the tiniest amount of capital could provide the necessary amount required for the most basic of processing. It was only through combining their small amounts of capital collectively that the critical mass could be achieved. One of the earliest co-ops, of course, was established here in Borrisoleigh in 1908. And Tim Ryan Sr., Bobby's grandfather from Rathcarden, was its first manager, and the parish priest at the time, Father Patrick Ryan, was its first chairman. Now this is the best photograph I could get of the creamery around about the early 1900s. Some of you will remember the milk would have come in on the far left hand side there. And I'm told it was great sport just to go on when the department inspector wasn't looking to make sure that the milk was accepted into the separator. And on the right hand side there you can see Borrisoleigh, of course, had its own brand of butter. They had to change the name from Golden Vale to Golden Valley because another co-op essentially stole the Borrisoleigh name. But we couldn't sue them, or wasn't able to sue them because we didn't have enough money. So not much has changed. There were 60 founding shareholders that contributed at the time £347, which actually is about €34,000 in today's money, on the basis of a £1 share per cow. There were another 24 farmers, although there was overlap, who acted as guarantors to the National Bank in Tullamore. Within a year, the number of shareholders had grown to 92. Back in the day, at that time, total milk supply was about 164,000 litres, or almost 3,300 litres per supplier. Now, as these figures imply, the average yield per cow was 2,082 litres. Very low compared to today, but interestingly, for me anyway, the butterfat content did appear to be relatively high. And thanks to Seamus Tynan, I learned an interesting snippet that the creamery supplied electricity to the village. And it was managed by Jack Mott up to the operation of Arden Crusher in the late 1920s. And interestingly, after that, Tim Ryan Sr. converted the generator to run a hydro system at his own house in Rathcarn. I had known about that, but I hadn't known about the role that Jack Mott played in supplying electricity from the creamery to the village. One can only imagine the immense organisational drive that was required to achieve collectivisation among farmers in those early years. Highly dedicated people had to travel the length and breadth of Ireland to preach the message of cooperation. And while Plunkett was the visionary who gave rise to the cooperative movement, the man who set up the cooperative movement throughout every parish in Ireland, actually hailed from Tour, Newport, was Dr. Henry Kennedy. He was chief executive of the Irish Agricultural Organisation Societies, now ICOS. I'm glad to see his president, Edward Carr, is here this evening, current president. And of course, in those days, the CEO was tend to last a long time. He was 40 years CEO. I think today they suggest 5 years is enough. Incidentally, I was lectured in UCD in mathematics by the son of Henry Kennedy, Maurice Kennedy, including at that time when I was in UCD on Saturday mornings. Never a great time for having to listen to a lecture in mathematics. But anyway, that's the way it was. The early co-ops were constructed at virtually every crossroad for the simple reason that the public transport infrastructure was very poor, as you can imagine, and farmers themselves had very limited transport facilities. Well into the 1960s, farmers delivered their milk themselves from a few cows to their local creameries with various forms of animal transport. Sorry, I meant to mention that. This is the is a very important slide, and I actually remember when Borrisoleigh won the Reed Cup for milk quality in 1969, and you probably recognise certainly 3 of those people there: Tim Ryan Jr., Catherine McSherry, and Packy Finn, who was chairman. But the milk transport to creameries was the nature of the day. Now, some of you I'm looking out at you, remember what that was like. I certainly do. And in particular, I vividly recall a neighbour of ours, Kate Costello. I'm sure you'll all remember her. She had a big grey horse, and she used to sit, well, she didn't really sit, she stood on the common car and leaned back against the big tank and walloping the horse going down the road. And I remember that vividly, and of course all the other people that would go to the creamery on the regular basis. Of course, at the creamery, the milk was separated into cream and skim milk, and the cream was then processed mainly into butter and cream in Borrisoleigh, but of course in cheese in other creameries. But farmers took home their skim and fed it to their animals, mainly pigs. And that system remained essentially unchanged for several decades. Of course, the modern collection and haulage of milk is so different to what it was back in the early 1900s, and for several years right up to the late 1960s indeed. I mentioned the way the farmers would take home the skim. It's really ironic, and it's one of the things about the evolution of milk and milk processing, is back then skim was considered a low-value product, but it has since become the most valuable raw material in various human nutritional products. Milk is truly an extraordinary product, and I don't think we've seen the end of the possibilities in terms of the type of products that can be produced. The organisational structure of milk processing in Ireland has undergone a lot of change over the years. You had rapid growth in the establishment of co-ops in the early years, the 1890s up to the 1920s. And that was followed by a long period of consolidation up to the 1960s. The improvement in roads, of course, together with the much greater ability of the co-ops to collect and haul milk from longer distances, and then with new processing technology generating higher economies of scale, it was inevitable that a rationalisation, as it was called, of the historical co-op structure would have to occur. By around 1930, Borrisoleigh was taking in milk from 4 independent creameries, Kilvicaris, Clodagh, Gortigary and Templederry. And Templederry incidentally amalgamated with Borrisoleigh in 1934. And also Corabad, which Borrisoleigh owned, in addition to its own direct supply. At that time, 1930, there were about 800 milk suppliers in total supplying milk to Borrisoleigh. 200 of these supplied milk directly. And they supplied 1.95 million litres at the time. The average price of milk was about 1 cent per litre back then. Doesn't sound much. But in today's money, that's over 70 cents per litre. Now you're going to be given out at the price you're getting at the minute for your milk, but way higher than what's being paid today. The 1960s and 70s witnessed a substantial shrinkage in the number of co-ops in the country as a whole, from close to 190 in 1961 to just 57 in 1975 and to about 19 today, although in effect there are about 8 co-op groups in the country at the moment. And as you can imagine, and I think some of the budding historians out here might come back and write this up, the rationalisation stage was a very difficult one for many rural communities. Such was the understandable attachment and sense of ownership that farmers had in their own co-op. And Borrisoleigh, of course, wasn't immune to that process of rationalisation. In 1969, the year that Borrisoleigh won the Reed Cup for the best quality butter in Ireland, its supply of milk was over 9 million litres, but supplier numbers had declined to a little over 400, nearly a halving in 30 years. But interestingly today, and I got these figures hot off the press, so to speak, there are just 55 milk suppliers in Borrisoleigh now supplying Ara Tip with over 55 million litres of milk. Within 2 years, that's following 1969, Borrisoleigh had itself become a headline in the rationalisation process, with its amalgamation with Tipperary Co-op in April 1971. Following accession to the European Community, now as we know it as the EU in 1973, the larger co-ops, the likes of Kerry and Glanbia, extended their ambitions. It gave what they had experienced in Ireland, gave them the confidence to stretch their wings on the international stage. And it led to a number of co-ops forming public limited companies, or PLCs. But they did retain a linkage of some form with the traditional co-op structure. And in recent years, interestingly enough, the PLC companies have gone their own direction with their own line of products, leaving the co-ops again to focus on milk processing. I consider that this is a personal view of course, that the birth of modern Irish agriculture commenced with the Lemass Whittaker opening up of the Irish economy from the late 1950s onwards. Their clear focus was on export-driven economic growth, which was signalled in the first programme for economic expansion and culminated, of course, in us joining what was then called the EEC in 1973. I would strongly argue that Whittaker's first programme is still relevant to this day. Most commentators, when they look at the first programme, focus on the broad macroeconomic messages. But what's often neglected is that the bulk of the document is actually concerned with agricultural policy. And incidentally, Whittaker had a dry Northern Ireland sense of humour. I once had the pleasure of sitting next to him at a lunch and we got talking. Now, I knew he had a keen interest in trout fishing on the Great Western Lakes, and we talked about this, with me telling him that I too was interested in fishing. Of course, he asked me what type of fishing was I interested in. And when I told him sea fishing, he paused, looked at me and said, "Oh, you mean weightlifting?" That was the kind of man he was. Whittaker, through the first programme, time and time again, emphasises the importance of driving higher productivity in Irish agriculture and food processing, given the imperative of securing export markets for our food. And the first programme is quite categoric about this, stating that state assistance should concentrate less on price supports and guarantees than on measures designed to bring about increased agricultural productivity, in other words, lower production costs per unit of output. That was in 1958. Still relevant not just to agriculture, but to every sector of industry. Whittaker was an extraordinary man. Clearly understood that if public policy was to address competitiveness, the focus simply had to be in productivity. But in my opinion, the most enduring message of the first programme is that it pointed to the need for a small open economy like ours to look outwards. Certainly from the 30s onwards, we hadn't done that. We looked inwards. And in the process, of course, we suffered with poorly performing living standards and high levels of emigration. The most important first step towards implementing that outward-looking strategy was Sean Lemass's letter of application in 1961 to join the EEC. And because of President de Gaulle's hostility, the French president, to the UK, it was to take two further attempts before we eventually joined in 1973, along with the UK and Denmark. I'm sure that most of you here, anyway, will agree that joining the EEC was by far the single most important development that has defined modern Irish agriculture. At one bound, it enabled Irish agriculture to break free from the crippling British cheap food policy. The late great Seamus Sheedy of UCD, who hailed, by the way, from Ballyporeen, in comparing Irish agricultural prices in the 3 years 1976 to 1978, but the 3 years 1969 to 71, in other words, straddling the period of joining the EEC, showed that Irish livestock prices grew by almost 240%, with milk prices jumping by 260%. Crop prices increased by just over 200%, with barley leading the way by 220%. Now don't worry, I'm not going to embark on a history of EU membership, except to note that it had its ups and downs. The cattle and energy crisis of 1974-75 probably made some farmers wonder if the right decision had been made in joining. The farm debt situation in the late 1970s and of course the introduction of the milk quota in 1984 were additional setbacks that the sector and farmers had to endure. But in fact, ongoing reform of the Common Agricultural Policy, from almost when we first joined the EEC to the present day, has been a source of frustration. But I would have to say, from my perspective, the overall benefits of joining the European Union and all that has followed have cancelled out the negatives since we attained membership. Apart from the country opening up to the world during the 1960s, there were also momentous stirrings afoot among the relatively newly minted farming organisations. Farmers soon found their mojo, that culminated, of course, in the famous march to Dublin in 1966 from all corners of Ireland. I was going to say that some of you here might have participated in that, but I don't know. You know, of course, one of the celebrated events of that march when they got to Dublin was that 9 of the men of the NFA sat for 21 days and nights outside of the Department of Agriculture, waiting to be seen by the then Minister, Charlie Haughey. And of course, we're a great witty people in Ireland, and where they sat, of course, was wittily known as Checkpoint Charlie, which of course was the East Berlin checkpoint. But the one thing about that march, which is hugely significant, is that farmers found their voice. They had rebelled against the hegemony of the Department of Agriculture. It was almost like God as far as most farmers were concerned. And there's one of the farmers, Mikey Gibbons, his wife Anne Gibbons, who wrote a paper a few years ago expressing her views on that march. And she commented, which I think most people would say is very true. The climate of the time, she said, was that all knowledge rested with the department. The department certainly believed this. And she said farmers were tired of being talked down to. And a new attitude to the problems of agriculture was needed. The scene, that march, had set a change of attitude. Of course, it was to take another 2 years or so or more before sense prevailed in the department, when T.J. Maher, another Tipperary man, NFA president at the time, met with Taoiseach Jack Lynch. And the outcome was that government agreed to recognise the NFA's right to represent the interests of farmers. I think today we might take that for granted, but that was a very significant step in terms of representation. Of course, Irish agriculture is a very different place today than what it looked like in the early 1960s. The most obvious change has been in the reduction of the number of farmers and those employed in farming. This trend, of course, is a worldwide phenomenon, as a traditionally low productivity and hence low income sector leads workers to higher paying jobs in other sectors as economic growth gathers pace. The predominant farming activity throughout the country was dairying, but all farms farmed a bit of everything, from tillage, dry cattle, sheep, and of course pigs and hens, which with the creamery check were a major source of cash. Today, of course, farming is far more specialised. Back then, many farms in the early 60s still operated at close to subsistence, where money was exceptionally scarce. The number of people employed in Irish agriculture back then, the early 1960s, was 378,000, of which almost 90% were male. The number of farmers is estimated in 1960 to be about 210,000. In the most recent census, 279,000 were considered to be engaged in agriculture, and the share of males had fallen to 73%. The number of farmers, however, in the most recent census, were estimated to be a little over 130,000. So in compound growth terms, this is a fall of almost 50% in the number of farmers over the last 60 years. One profound structural change that has occurred, which I think has had a massive impact on Irish agriculture, is the percentage of farmers that now have formal education, frequently at the highest level. Under 60%, just under 60% of farmers today have received formal agricultural education. And in dairying, it's nearly 85%. In the early 1960s, that figure would have been negative. And there's probably a whole cultural and sociological reason for that. Annual farm incomes, and these are average, annual farm incomes in the early to mid-1960s were just under €400 a year. At the time, that was about 80% of the average wage of a non-agricultural worker. The 60,000 farm labourers at the time earned an average wage of just under 70% of family farm income. Last year, the average farm income, was about €36,000 on average. Of course, one thing that hasn't changed over the years is the volatility of farm incomes driven by fluctuations in prices and weather conditions. €400 in the mid-60s would be worth a little over €10,000 today. So even an average income of 36,000 today, which is dismal enough, still indicates that farm incomes have grown substantially in real terms since the early 1960s. So there's definitely more prosperity on Irish farms today. Milk prices, and I mentioned them earlier going way back, were about 2.8 cents per litre in the early 60s. That's well over 70 cents per litre in today's money. So today's money, depending on the co-op, and I won't say which one is out there at the top, but prices are around the 50 cent mark. So in real terms, milk prices are actually less today than they were back in the day. Beef prices, as we all know, have undergone extraordinary change in recent times. Beef prices received by farmers in 1960-61 were about 10 euro cent per kilogram, or 2.4 euro in today's money values. And of course, prices today are at an all-time high of 7.7 euro a kilogram. Land prices have changed hugely over the last 60 years. The average price of land, believe it or not, in the early 60s was about 108 euro an acre. In current days money values, that's about 2,800 euro. Well below, of course, the average price that's being paid of nearly 10,000 euro an acre, and much higher, of course, for higher quality land, which is upwards of 13,000. It's being paid in recent times. Of course, the most obvious change that has occurred between then and now is the change in scale in every dimension of agriculture. The average farm size in 1960 was about 35 acres, compared to 86 acres today. Land tenure has also changed dramatically, and in a way that I don't think is fully appreciated. Today, about 35% of agricultural land is rented, and almost 60% of farmers, on average, are renting some land. That would have been unheard of in the 1960s. Land use has also changed dramatically. The biggest change has occurred in cereal crops, which have fallen from about 500,000 hectares in the early 60s to 0.27 million hectares now, a decline of 46%. Of course, a big part of that decline was due to the horse. You had to have votes for the horse when the horse started declining in numbers. so did the acreage of oats. But there are other factors. In the early 1960s, the average sow herd in Ireland was just 10 sows. Today, the average herd is in excess of 700. In the early 1960s, we had 110,000 pig farmers. Today, we've only about, probably less even, it's reckoned 280 just commercial pig producers. I remember a number of years ago being at an event in Teagasc Moor Park to honour Jim O'Grady, who was a Tipperary man from the Glen of Aherlow and a specialist in pig husbandry. Jim used to present a slot on pigs and Telefish Ferman. Again, some of you might remember that. Along with Justin Keating. And it was a popular on RT at the time. But Jim was on one night and he was commenting about the increase in the average pig herd on farms occurring in the early 1960s. And he stopped and looked at the camera and he says, you know, he says, there are some men out there with 20 sows. Of course, as I said, the average today is 700. As an aside, and I was a great fan of these programs, Landmark followed. On another program in the same series, Telefish Ferman, the late Joe Murray, some of you might have remembered him, he visited farms once in the west of Ireland, inquiring about the challenges of farming on the western seaboard. One of the farmers he interviewed had a large family, with 14 children. And when asked by Joe about the biggest farming challenge that he faced in his farm, he answered, fertility, sir. In the early 1960s, we had about 1.2 million dairy cows, producing an average yield of, in around the 2,000 litres. Today we've 1.6 million cows, producing an average yield of just under 6,000 litres. Back in the early 60s, we had around 130,000 dairy farmers. Today we've just 17,000 or less, actually. In the early 1960s, the average dairy herd in Ireland was probably about 6 to 7 cows, believe it or not. Before we joined the EEC, that average had risen to about 10 cows. Today, the average dairy herd is close to 100 cows. I do some work with an African charity, and I was at a dairy conference, in fact, their first dairy conference in Eritrea about 18 months ago. And they were very interested to learn about the strides that we've made in milk production over the last 65 years. Their average herd, the border with Ethiopia, is now about the same size as ours was back in the early 1960s. We were about 6 to 7 cows. It's very difficult for us today to imagine what the regularity of the milk check would have meant to Irish farm families in the early 1960s. I'm sure, though, that it's not too dissimilar to what it means to a small African farmer today. And I remember vividly talking to an African farmer that had benefited from the receipt of an in-calf heifer under a government scheme, very like the lamented Boer scheme. This man had 8 children, and he was as proud of the punch of the cow that he got. And he remember him saying to me that the single cow fed its calf, provided milk for the household, and there was still milk left over, believe it or not, that could be traded for cash. Yields of wheat and barley at the time were only about 3 tonnes per hectare in the mid-1960s. Winter wheat yields today are almost 10.5 tonnes, and barley is over 8 tonnes. We've actually got one of the highest winter wheat yields in the world, higher than the Paris Basin. But unfortunately, it doesn't mean we're the most competitive. Our costs are excessive owing to our climate. Some of the most profound changes that have taken place in agriculture over the last 60 years have involved the adoption of new technologies, including machinery. New farming technology generated opportunities to do things better, but also to reduce drudgery and to improve safety on farms. And drudgery was part and parcel of farming life, both inside and outside the farming household. Farming women in particular were burdened by much of that drudgery. Farming women had not only to cope with all of the normal household pressures of raising families and caring for elderly relatives, but they were also essential cogs in the running of the farm, especially in the preparation of feed for the animals and fowl, milking and the feeding of calves. Developments in the cooking of food and in the baking of bread and in the washing of clothes were liberating for generations of farming women that are not sufficiently appreciated, in my view, or documented. The invention of the washing machine and the clothes wringer must have been godsends for hard-pressed farming women. Machine milking was also an innovation that lifted the drudgery of hand milking for many women, who had no shortage, as I said, of manual labour to do around the farm. By the way, I would urge you, if you haven't done so already, and I think it would be an interesting excursion anyhow for the society, to visit the Teagasc Agricultural Museum in Johnstown Castle, Wexford. The progression, as you can see, in milking technology is extraordinary. From the hand milking to the bucket plant to the herringbone system, which most dairy farmers have today. But in Johnstown Castle, you'll see not only fascinating displays of farm machinery, but what I personally always find more interesting are the displays that show the evolution of domestic appliances within farm households. And of course, we'll take the milking system now. Some of you out here may have rotary parlours, I don't know. More of you may have the automatic milking machine. Of course, on the farm back in the 1960s, the most important machines were horses. Horse numbers ranged from about 400 to 500,000 each year from the famine to the late 1940s, and stood at over 220,000 in 1960. The emergence of the tractor, of course, put an end to the working horse. Tractor numbers grew from little over 1,000 pre-World War II to 44,000 by 1960. Today there are about 200,000 tractors, about the same number as the number of horses in the early 60s. And of course these tractors are far more powerful than their 1960 counterparts. And I have a lovely slide here which I put together of two great ploughing men. On the right hand side here, John Delaney ploughing, I assume in Rathmoy.
Yeah.
And Michal,
Yes, Gerry.
yeah, tells me that normally he'd have two horses, but he was ploughing a haggard. On the left hand side here we have Paddy Welsh, rather, and he's actually ploughing in our own haggard at home. I recognise it from the background. But when we think about changes in technology, it's not only about the use of more and more sophisticated farm machinery. Although farm machinery investment often goes hand in hand with new ways of doing things. And there have been so many innovations, and many of you will have favourites of your own on farm that have happened over the last 60 to 65 years. It'd be impossible to document all of them. But for me, four stand out. The first one is the extraordinary growth in fertiliser use that has enabled us to realise the immense value of our grasslands. I remember going to school, primary school, and you'd be asked about our national resources. Our ability to grow grass was never once mentioned. It was always about mining or something like that. Our grasslands, actually. And it seemed global, appreciated globally. We only belatedly realised that our greatest national resource natural resource is our ability to grow grass abundantly and more cheaply than any other source of animal food. Our embrace of synthetic fertilizer, or chemical fertilizer, from the 1970s onwards has been simply extraordinary. Before that, as the Bull McCabe would have declared, it was the manure of my fine heifers and bullocks that did the job. Very different since. In 1960, Irish farmers used about 30,000 tonnes of nitrogen. Today they use 310,000, an increase of over tenfold. I remember the chairman of Teagasc, Liam Harley, he remembers vividly as a young man being driven home from an open day in Moore Park by his father. And his father turned to him on the drive and said, "Liam, we're going to have to use more nitrogen. There's no way out of it." Of course, as we know, our embrace of fertilizers has proved to be a double-edged sword. It has greatly enabled us to increase the production and utilization of our grasslands, but it's also disimproved water quality and resulted in greenhouse gas emissions. One of the other innovations I'd like to single out, apart from fertilizer use, and that's related to this one I want to talk about, has been in the management of our grasslands. And of course, there's a twofold aspect to this. One is the management of conserved feed. And this is, on the left-hand side, Joe DeWan, neighbour of ours in Ballaroo, great character. And there's Joe, and again it's an hour haggard, he's cutting hay with a scythe. And on the right-hand side we see what we call around here the trams of hay. But there's no doubt that the shift from hay-making to silage harvesting and pit storage was a feature of the late 1960s and 70s that many of us can recall. And later, the emergence of bale silage was an important innovation. But personally, and this is very much a personal view, I place innovation in grazing practices and the breeding of new grass and clover varieties to be even of greater significance than the harvesting of forage. The adoption in particular of rotational grazing, aided by the use of information technology and computerization, has pushed production efficiency to new heights. That's the rotational paddock system. Of course, a third great innovation in my view in the last 30 years has been the advances in animal genetics through the widespread use of breeding indices and more recently what we call genomic selection. Extraordinary and powerful leaps forward in science. My former colleague from Teagasc, Dunberry, one of the most renowned geneticists, livestock geneticists in the world actually, reckons that genetic research coupled with advisory support has returned over €20 for every €1 spent. It's been an extraordinary rate of return that has boosted profitability, efficiency and income, of course. Another development which has been hugely significant is of course in the trading of animals. The trading of animals has become much more transparent and therefore efficient with the emergence of the mart and now its modern online version. And here we have on your left hand side there the Fair of Borris. One photograph from Fair of Borris occurred on the 27th of November. And of course it was also the day when us youngsters, we looked forward to the fair. We got a few bob when we were older for minding cattle. But we also were able to visit Winnie Fatty's on Chapel Street. And by Jesus was that Aladdin's Gate. Absolutely, I can still remember it. And you'd be saying, could you afford that? Or the younger lads, could you get it? Were you going to get it off Santa? You know, They were the times. On the right-hand side, we have the opening of the Martin Nina in 1957. A friend of mine from the west of Ireland tells a story about the cute lads that have cattle to sell in a particular town. Now, he didn't state the town, in the town. But he said they used to get in early in the morning and they'd pick this particular spot on a street because there was an upward slope, so they could put the light cattle at the back. And the mart, of course, put an end to all that cuteness. Actually, I remember a few years ago when I was director of Teagasc visiting Inisheer and talking to the farmers there, I learned that they didn't have a weighing scales and were solely dependent on the buyer from the mainland to declare the weights of the cattle he was buying. And I decided to get them a weighing scales. And I'd love to have been there on the next occasion when the buyer was on the island to buy cattle. You could just imagine what it's like. Of course, today we have the mart, and during COVID, we have the virtual mart, the online mart. There are undoubtedly other important technological developments in the areas of farm machinery, animal medicine in particular, that could be noted. But for me, there's been one outstanding enabling factor that should be mentioned also. It's not a technology, but it's a method of networking and learning from each other. And of course, what I'm talking about, what I characterize as the modern version of the meta, which of course are discussion groups. Farming today is a very lonely occupation, and discussion groups can play an important role not only in initiating and supporting change on farms, but also in providing an opportunity for much needed social interaction. Farmers don't have access to a boardroom of directors to discuss strategy. And of course that's it, with a lot of strategy discussed when they were delivering milk to the creamery and other matters as well. But a discussion group facilitated by a good chairman and supported by an advisor is a good substitute. I want to conclude, ladies and gentlemen, by asking a question that I can't answer, but some of you might have views on. What will the next 60 years be like for the agricultural sector? I think there are some roots of the future that are well established, however. There's no doubt about it that dairy farms will undoubtedly get bigger. The only question is over what time frame. And the numbers of dairy farmers will continue to fall. I think we're going to see a shift towards the production of dairy-based beef. It'll be driven by relative profitability and facilitated by technologies like genetics and sex seeding. I think it's unlikely that by 2030 we'll hit the pre-quota level of beef cows, which is about 400,000 head. But all the forecasts suggest that by 2030 we'll be down to about 500 to 600,000 beef cows. Another obvious route that has grown into a sapling at this stage concerns, of course, the challenges posed by environmental regulations concerning water quality, biodiversity and climate change. The hope for all of us is that we can deal with these challenges without adversely impacting on farm productivity, profitability and food security. I'm optimistic that technology can help enormously. And if you look at the dire predictions that have been made for society from time to time over the years, and also for the economy, most of these dire predictions were overturned by technological developments. I'm confident, for example, that developments in the use of clover, animal genetics, feed and manure additives will drastically change the sustainability performance of Irish agriculture. However, some of the possible developments in environmental policies that have been mooted, such as carbon farming, and the recognition that methane is a short-lived gas are very much up in the air in terms of their likely implementation. But I'm absolutely convinced as we approach the end of this decade, we'll hear a lot more about these ideas. Other possible future developments are more speculative. And there's always a danger, I think, when you're looking forward. It's very difficult to get out of where you are now. You're anchored in the present, to some extent, maybe too much. At present, our grasslands resource is being harnessed to convert energy into human and animal food. It's possible that more of this resource will be used to produce electricity and biofuels. The science does exist for this to happen, but perhaps policy is lagging. On a much longer term perspective, at lab scale, scientists are working to convert protein directly from grass into edible forms for animals and possibly humans. Work is well advanced also in what we call precision fermentation technologies that can synthetically produce milk and meat. The use of plant-based proteins in products that have traditionally relied exclusively on animal proteins is already well advanced. Many of these developments are far removed from commercial exploitation at this stage. But look what's happened over the last 50, 60 years. And over that time horizon, there's every chance that many of these developments will become more competitive. My final thought concerns the durability of the family farm as a dominant model of farming in Ireland. It's the envy of many people in many other countries. That we still are able to maintain a relatively small-scale farm under family ownership. We've seen in recent years, and it's not on a large scale, but it's out there, the emergence of what I call the managing director type of farmer, who owns or leases several farms that are all managed to a common template, and where the individual farms are managed and run on a day-to-day basis by employees. While this trend is small, it's likely that it will accelerate into the future. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention.
Gerry Boyle, it's only you could do it. Thank you very much for a magnificent presentation. The information and the slides spellbinding. We are absolutely overawed, thrilled and grateful to you for your presentation and your presence here tonight. It is remarkable that on, we'll say, Halloween, you beautifully touched on the past and the present, on a night when the veil between earth and heaven is wafer thin. So you acknowledge our forebears and you pay tribute to the men and women of the present day. For that, we thank you and we are very grateful. Now, as I discussed with Gerry earlier on, we'll now have a little chat, a few questions and a few stories for the next whatever. And of course, we couldn't let the night go then without having tea and barnbrack for Halloween. So feel free to talk and to chat and then we'll dive. Thanks everybody. I just want to say something, just going back a mere 70 years.